So, for those who have joined the stream, thank you for joining today. The first topic that we're looking at here is the Trump administration and it launching what it calls the Operation Economic Outcast, which is a sanctions campaign against Iran. And their strategic petroleum reserves have dropped to their lowest level since 1970. So even though they have announced that they are carrying out these actions against Iran. And by the way, they've already sanctioned Iran to the absolute limit. What they're doing now and what this strategy is centered around is an attempt to force countries that are aligned with Iran to back out of their relationships. So they want the Iraqi government to close the borders with Iran, stop Iranian aircraft from landing in their territory. They're wanting, evidently, China and Russia and others to stop interacting with the Iranians or be hit by secondary economic sanctions. And as they're doing this, their strategic petroleum reserves, there's only roughly about 41 days, according to the reports that have emerged today, that they have left of these strategic petroleum reserves. And that means that oil prices are going to shoot up through the roof. No amount of market manipulation is going to change that. No amount of Axios reports claiming that there are more ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz are going to change that. This is a last-ditch attempt by the U.S. Trump administration to pressure the Iranians without going to full-scale military conflict once again. And it looks like this is all about to come to a head. So right now, what we've got happening is that the other fronts are significantly escalating. Iran, like I said, has put its finishing touches on its missile bases. It's been readying. Even the Israeli media have been reporting about the dramatic recovery of Iran's munitions, its stockpiles of drones and ballistic missiles, which is a major setback for the United States and the Israelis because they had hoped to stop production or severely impact production of Iran's ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. They haven't been able to do that, and they haven't been able to take them out either. So what's going to have to happen likely now is that we're going to have a scenario where the Israelis are most likely going to have to join from very early on in a confrontation with Iran. If the United States are the one to carry it out and Iran is not going to choose to do a series of preemptive strikes itself, because the Iranians in previous rounds, when we had the so-called memorandum of understanding, which was dead in the water as soon as the Americans refused to include Lebanon in it, and in fact struck a memorandum of understanding between the Israelis and their proxies in Beirut, which allowed for Israel to stay in the south of Lebanon. They messed up greatly in doing that, and it showed that the Israelis have significant hold over the Trump administration. But we have these clashes in the Strait of Hormuz where U.S. military vessels would fire onto southern Iran. We had as well them firing HIMARS into Iranian territory and striking the southernmost portion of Iran. Of course, that has not taken out their capabilities and prevented them from striking tankers that are attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz without their permission. And the reason why Israel has to be used here is because Israel will basically suppress the rates of Iranian ballistic missile fire from their bases throughout the country. So Iran has its missile bases strategically placed throughout its territory. And in doing this, it's able to keep up a rate of fire from these different bases. And without that Israeli fire to sort of suppress Iran, hit the entrances and exits, and keep Iran on its feet, it can fire off almost unlimited amounts of missiles at any time of its choosing. And we saw the dangers of an escalation like happened during the MOU period between the US and Iran, because simply put, the Iranians could fire missiles at will, and the United States, without doing a large-scale attack on Iran alongside the Israelis was not capable of stopping Iranian ballistic missile fire. And we do know from the evidence that has emerged that Iran has also acquired better live intelligence. That being said, the Yemen front has significantly escalated. And again, this is not good news for the United States and its strategic reserves of petroleum at all. In fact, this is a disaster for them because Yemen's Ansar Allah, the Yemeni armed forces, earlier today struck an oil supertanker in the Red Sea that was off of Yanbu in Saudi Arabia. And we first saw the reports emerge that a ship was hit. They later confirmed that it was indeed them. And this is very far away from Yemeni territory, which demonstrates that they're now hitting tankers at a very long distance away from their own territory. But not only that, the Ansar Allah have been targeting tankers and convoys that are attempting to flood weapons into Yemen to supply the Saudi proxy forces, the opposition in Yemen. And they've been successfully carrying out those hits. There's been some devastating hits today. Here's some footage as well of what emerged earlier, that they hit a weapons depot. According to the reports, that's what that footage there is showing. And not only are the Yemeni armed forces ramping up their attacks against the Saudi proxy forces inside of Yemen in Marib and down south as well. They struck a target around a day ago in Aden, but they are also ramping up their strikes on Saudi targets too. Again, this is some satellite imagery here, which shows damage to a site in Yanbu in Saudi Arabia. And this is the area anyway itself, not that target specifically, is in a port city from where the Saudis are attempting to be able to export oil. And they were exporting around 6 million barrels of oil per day. That has dropped right down. If they're able to get any out, they have to take a different route. So the alternative has been for the Saudis to have to, if there's tankers elsewhere, they're going to have to go all the way around the African continent through the Mediterranean and then transit through the Suez Canal and end up in Saudi territory. And if they want to go the other way, of course, they have to go around as well. But even that has not been successful because these tankers are getting struck. And even if Yemen's armed forces cannot catch every single tanker, the insurance costs go through the roof, which means this hits the consumers, this impacts the market, there's general instability, and Saudi Arabia is now choked from both sides. So this is, of course, ongoing. Something else that emerged, which was quite interesting, and we're going to show the footage. This emerged since our live last week on Thursday. This is footage released by the Yemeni armed forces, the armed forces of Ansar Allah, the Ansar Allah-led government in Sana'a. And this footage shows not their precision drone strikes, not their ballistic missile or cruise missile attacks, but the attacks that they've carried out using these quadcopter drones that they then use to drop unguided munitions. So just before we play this, as a disclaimer, like we always do on here, this is not, of course, an endorsement of the material, and it is for educational purposes. So just so everyone's aware, the full footage is 10 minutes long. And so we've had to cut out the actual moments of impact on many of these clips because, of course, they're dropping these munitions on troop gatherings, and they're rather, let's say, graphic afterwards, so we've cut that out. But there are a number of direct hits that we're able to show here that do not show the actual moment of impact on individual troops. Again, if you want to go and watch the full clips where you can see the graphic details, you can do so. That should be on our Telegram and X account, where you can watch the full videos. And this shows the exact impact and what these munitions are doing. So again, we're still, and all of those forces, if you watch the full video here, that's a tank. By the way, something that I might note about this is that these are unguided munitions, and these hits, and there's 10 minutes of footage showing this, these hits are direct. They're so precise. And quite frankly, I've watched a lot of footage from different groups and militaries using these drones, and this takes a lot of training and talent to be able to pull these attacks off. So this attack here on this tank, for example, according to Yemeni media, was carried out over the border inside Saudi territory. So these, what you're seeing are not just the Saudi proxy forces that are getting hit with these drones, but also perhaps Saudi forces themselves, or maybe as well their proxies that they might tend to use along the border because they don't like to lose their own soldiers. But nevertheless, it's in Saudi territory. So again, from that sort of height to hit that tank, and that's a tank kill hit right there. So this shows that they, of course, have significant training. Again, we're just cutting these off so you don't see the exact moment of impact on those soldiers. And again, these munitions are dropping directly on their targets. And it does display that, you know, Yemen's Ansar Allah are no joke militarily. We've seen as well them demonstrate their capabilities on the battlefield time and time again. I think that's well known at this point. But for example, these kinds of munitions dropped from quadcopters. We've seen this used by the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. We've seen Hezbollah use these as well. So these are across the entire region, but these hits are extremely accurate. So we're seeing very, very accurate strikes here with unguided munitions. So you're tearing through the opposition there. And of course, there was footage from the other side, which was released showing some of the Yemeni armed forces getting hit on the battlefield as well. So, you know, it's raging on the war on both sides. But this is really the first battle footage that we have got released by Ansar Allah, other than the satellite imagery that is released, and also as well, you know, people, bystanders taking videos of drone and missile attacks on different positions as well, because we have got some footage come out from that. And it will be interesting to see what further footage comes out, because again, this is simply just with these drones dropping these unguided munitions. And we have an enormous amount of footage that has just emerged showing this. And these were not reported as well. We didn't get live reports of these attacks happening. We knew that there were clashes on the ground, and Ansar Allah was claiming hundreds of casualties among Saudi-backed forces, but we didn't get any confirmation of that, of course. So this appears to be corroborating those claims that indeed lots of Saudi-backed forces have been taken out. And again, there's an enormous amount of footage that was just released of this. And the interesting thing is here is that there's been little to no coverage of this and what has been carried out here. by the Yemeni armed forces. And already we're seeing their positions get struck, their military vehicles and tanks being taken out. And the response has been very lackluster from the Saudi-backed forces. That's what we could say about that. Again, dropping 4 munitions there, and we cut it off before there's the actual impact. So that footage has just emerged from Yemen, and the situation there appears to be on the verge of perhaps a new offensive breaking out. But so far, what's happening is that the Yemeni armed forces are sort of breaking down their opposition, and Saudi Arabia looks to be rather hesitant to engage in this fight. In fact, Saudi Arabia is working against its best interests here if it was to, in fact, engage in direct warfare with the Yemeni armed forces at this point. One of the reasons for that is they're already blockaded from the Strait of Hormuz. They've got no military option against Iran. They have no military option in Yemen. They've been fighting this war since 2015. They had, periods where their forces were much more capable, a lot stronger, had more successes on the battlefield. Now they're weakened. The Emiratis have been pushed out, so that issue as well is no longer there, with the Emirati-backed forces being active and the United Arab Emirates having a large role to play in Yemen, because Saudi sort of pushed them out when they acted up at the start of the year and got rid of the Sovereign Transitional Council. But and in a way that actually makes it easier for Saudi Arabia to come to the table and do a deal with the Ansarullah-led government. But the reason why they can't do it is because, again, as we've covered in the show before, this would encourage movements throughout the Arab world that want to take back control of their country, that want to have sovereignty, and that seek to overthrow dictators. And so Saudi Arabia, being the monarchy that it is, that controls a country throughout the Arab Spring, that was fine if they could, control it after the fact in places like Egypt, and they could have an influence there. But they were not happy about the movement, the Arab Spring, because it was a direct threat to them. And the same came of the United Arab Emirates, specifically with them and their beef with the Muslim Brotherhood. Although the United Arab Emirates, their population are less likely to revolt. Saudi Arabia perhaps is more of a, let's say, more of a real country that has the capability for its population to perhaps do something at some point, views the predicament of Yemen as a very large threat. And of course, then as well, we know that the Israelis, the United States, the European Union, the British had all, from the very start, pushed Saudi Arabia to engage in its battle with Ansarullah, to carry out a regime change, install its puppet. And this was, of course, because what happened there directly challenges U.S. hegemony. It directly challenges Israel and the greater Israel project. And so Saudi Arabia was used in order to fight against that. And if history tells us anything, you don't win when you intervene in Yemen. Nobody wins by intervening in Yemen. That's just not how it is. And so talking about not being able to win, because that's something of a topic for today. Another development that's happened, and a lot of people asked for more coverage of what's going on inside of the West Bank, what's been happening with the Palestinian resistance. We're going to go through all of that today and look at what's been going on. But one of the key points here is that the Israeli military is now anticipating that there could be a widespread escalation inside of the West Bank. Now, again, this comes down to a number of different points. But the reason why they're so anxious about this is because it could very easily spin out of control. Recently, their soldiers, who just behave however they want to, and we're also going to go into that a little bit, killed this man in Jenin. His name's Fathi Khazem. And Fathi was a sort of leading figure in Jenin and was affiliated with the Fatah party for a very long time. The Israeli forces, they killed two of his sons because they were involved in what became the Jenin brigades that emerged in 2021. He wasn't, of course, himself involved in armed action, but, you know, he stood with these fighters, and they came into his house, and according to reports, they asked him to bow to them, these Israeli soldiers, and Fathi Khazem, being who he is, told them, "Who are you for me to bow to you?" So the Israelis decided to point their rifles at his chest and execute him in his house, of course, for no reason whatsoever. And then they'll just give whatever excuse. Oh, he was coming to attack us and all of the rest of it, right? The reason why I'm saying that and I'm covering this is because the Israeli soldiers themselves are completely out of control. They don't have these checks and balances in place like they used to. And of course, they've always been psychotic and murderous. And we know from decades and decades of the reports, both inside Palestine and from human rights organizations, we know a lot about what these Israeli soldiers have been engaged in. But there's been this slow deterioration in terms of the Israeli military and it actually following orders and listening to their superiors. And this is something I think people don't really cover a lot, and it factors into the escalation in the West Bank, what we may be seeing in the coming months. And this all circles back to this guy, an Israeli soldier named Elor Azaria. And the reason I'm starting here, there was other cases, but the reason I'm starting here is because it demonstrates how psychotic the Israeli society is. And you have to remember that the Israeli army is a citizens' army, which means all of its people go to the army unless they can get some sort of exemption. So this murderous moron, Elor Azaria, in 2016, in the city of Al Khalil, he was an occupation soldier, decided that he would go up to an unarmed Palestinian who was already shot laying on the ground and on camera put a bullet in the Palestinian man's head, executed him on camera in front of the entire world. Initially, the Israelis, of course, they didn't want to have to do anything about this. But when this video emerged and, you know, there was all of this backlash, there was pressure on the Israelis to do something about it. So what ended up happening is Elor Azaria ended up getting the lengthiest sentence of an Israeli soldier for killing a Palestinian in the West Bank. Initially, that was 18 months. Then they reduced it down to 14 months. The Israeli military also, they didn't immediately discharge him from the army. What they did is they demoted him from sergeant, right? That they demoted him from his rank. That's what they did. And then his court case was ongoing. And by the time that he ended up getting convicted, his conscription was over. So he had left the military and they didn't want him to return because he was a controversial case. But what happened during that period was that the Israeli society went nuts. They were heavily in favor of this murderous psychopath who, again, this is him. This is him, you know, after the fact, and a photo of him, he was smiling in court, happy, had full support from everyone around him, right, for what he did, executing a man who's laying on the floor already having been shot. And they raised hundreds of thousands for him, made him wealthy, turned him into a hero. and then he only ended up spending 14 months in jail. Again, why I reference this is because cases like this show how psychotic the Israeli society was getting and has got, and their opinions and where they are at psychologically. Because when you hold an Israeli soldier like him accountable and you say, hey, our army has laws, people flip out. They think that they have the right to kill whoever they want and do whatever they want. And very rarely they ever get punished for any of these war crimes they're committing. So they have this level of entitlement. And this is something that if you read the Israeli think tanks, this was in 2016, there was a great amount of concern about the Israeli soldiers not wanting to follow orders. And we've seen for small little things that Israeli soldiers will not follow orders. They'll do what they want. And the Israeli military eventually, after 2021, it started changing its rules of engagement in the West Bank. And it changed its rules of engagement in large part to help the Israeli society, the soldiers, and to make Israeli society happy. And so the Israelis, number one, it's a citizens' army. They do not like when their soldiers die. That's why they don't fight real wars. They fight from a distance, and they won't engage in close quarters combat and actually go after their enemy. They have to kill them from a distance and murder people indiscriminately. That's what they have to do in terms of their tactics. But that's the society. That's the soldiers. The soldiers operate with complete impunity to do whatever they want. You'd need only take the case of the Yemen detention center where 10 Israeli soldiers originally were arrested because there was a video of it happening for gang raping a Palestinian. None of them got convicted for sexual assault or rape or anything of the sort. 4 of them got very lesser charges, which are just insignificant. The rest of them get let off, and it was on videotape. And in fact, the chief prosecutor for the Israeli military, she ends up getting fired. She ends up getting in trouble and then tries to commit suicide twice and is a national disgrace. And as a result of the Yemen case, which happened during the genocide, Israelis, in particular the settlers, started protesting and having these right to rape protests in the streets. But they also stormed into military facilities and stormed into police facilities. So that just demonstrates where everything is at. You have this widespread belief amongst Israeli society that their soldiers can do no wrong, no matter what, especially against Palestinians, and they cannot be punished. The soldiers themselves are entitled and believe that they cannot be punished. And then you have another element which is on top of all of that. So this was something that was revealed by Plus 972 Mag a few years back in 2023. So this was concerning what's called, it's a military unit that was created called the Desert Frontier. So the Desert Frontier was a specific military unit which was set up in order for it to be run by Israeli extremist settlers, specifically people who became known as what they called the Hilltop Youth. So the Hilltop Youth, these Israeli settlers who would be armed and carry out these attacks on Palestinians, at one point they would even shoot at and attack Israeli soldiers because they believed that the soldiers were getting in the way of them being able to take over Palestinian land. And so they believed that they had the right to attack them. So for a while in the Israeli mainstream, they were viewed as a fringe. But we've gotten to the point now where the Israeli society is so incredibly psychotic, and the military itself is so psychotic and run by psychopaths, and that they don't even think strategically anymore. And the settler movement has grown so big. And to the Israelis, when they think of the settler movement, here's, for example, just a map. These are some of the settlements and settlement plans that were put forth earlier this year. They want to build 34 new settlements. in the West Bank. And these Israeli settlers they have their own Israeli military unit. They also have these settler militias, which are trained by the Israeli military and receive funding and all of this from different organizations. And you've got like these guard units, border guard units, which are formed of settlers which have been extracted from the Israeli military. So the lines became a little bit blurred, but they have these specific units now. And then they're building up as well inside of the West Bank these more settler-only units that function as these vigilante militias, as was reported earlier in the year. So you have more and more of these militia groups that start popping up all over the place, and they are ethnically cleansing Palestinian villages. They're going in, they're still besieging a number of Palestinian villages right now in the occupied West Bank, and they've ethnically cleansed at least more than 60 different communities in the occupied territories. The reason, again, I'm focusing in on this is because when you put it all together, the Israelis, the Israeli army, and the settlers, which are separate from the army, because these lines are now being blurred inside of the military itself, have such a strong movement and are able to do whatever they want, whenever they want. And if anyone is ever held accountable in any way, then they have a revolt. People will storm into military facilities. They'll storm into police stations. You have the Israeli security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a hardline, radical, racist settler himself, a complete psychopath. And so you have members of the Knesset, members of the cabinet that are also on the side of these settlers and are advocating for these settlers. But then there is a contingent within the military that looks at things strategically and goes, hey, we need to cool off and we need to try and stop this from boiling over, even though they can't do that. They can't control their soldiers. I remember when they sent forces into Rafah initially in the Gaza Strip, they held off for quite some time in 2024. And there was all the nonsense as if the US was going to impose red lines on the Israelis about invading Rafah. And the fear was that they would open fire on Egyptian forces. They would be provocative in what they did, and that it could possibly lead to a deterioration with the Egyptians and an end to Camp David, the Camp David Accords, which were signed, and the peace treaty between the two sides. When they sent their soldiers into Rafah, they were there burning everything down, smashing sculptures, and even eventually killed some Egyptian soldiers. They simply could not restrain them because they get away with anything they want to get away with. So how does this factor into everything? There's no accountability. You have these massive settler militias, which are individual like security units that have been set up throughout the occupied West Bank. And these individual security units are themselves radical, well-armed. They've been armed and trained by the Israeli military. A lot of them are ex-members of the army themselves. You have the likes of the Desert Frontier and other Israeli military units. You have the border guard militias, all of these groups. And then you have an extremely radicalized Israeli society as well that also, they're completely psychotic. And so you've got a recipe for disaster. On top of all of this, the Israeli army itself is actually now struggling to get enough reserves recruited. It's got, at least according to its own report, 12,000 a deficit of 12,000 soldiers that they need to fill. And the big issue for them here is that they're not capable of performing on all of these different fronts. So how does this again link into the West Bank resistance? Well, they're afraid that things are going to boil over into a clash, and the Palestinian armed groups that had reformed in the West Bank, of course, their power has been diminished. They've been cracked down upon, but those groups are still there. The members of those groups are still there. Lots of them have gone underground, and they're sort of hiding in hiding. But these groups do, in fact, exist. Some of them, for example, like the Jenin brigades. And we'll take a look at some footage here. We'll just have this rolling. So this is some, music videos they put together of these groups. And basically what happened with these organizations is they started emerging in 2021 after the brief war, which was called Saif al-Quds. And Saif al-Quds was the battle between Hamas and the Palestinian factions from Gaza. They got involved. People were out on the streets in Jerusalem. People came to the streets in the West Bank. And also, as well, in the 1948 territories, they came out as well. And it overwhelmed the Israelis. And they managed to get, a ceasefire and stop it. But it was very overwhelming for them. And this was because of their incursions into Al-Aqsa Mosque. This led to people being killed and injured in at least the injuries were in large numbers, hundreds being injured, inside of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so in 2021, you have these groups that you're seeing here on screen called the Jenin brigades in this case. And then you would have other factions that would evolve and pop up in places like Tulkarim and in Nablus. It was mainly focused in the north of the occupied West Bank. These guys are for Saraya al-Quds, which is the armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they emerged in the West Bank. Again, these were the first group to really pop up in 2021. They started first simply just resisting the Israelis as they'd run incursions into the Jenin refugee camp and surrounding areas. And so what they did is they started building these sort of roughly put together improvised explosive devices and detonating Israeli jeeps and armored personnel carriers when they would come in and their bulldozers. Some of the explosives were a lot more effective than others. But the point here is these groups sort of organically popped up as a response to what Israel was doing and wanted to unite with the resistance factions inside of Gaza. But in order to understand that, you sort of had to understand the history of the two territories, because the Gaza Strip, we'll just pull up a map, why not here, just so that this sort of makes a lot of more sense sometimes when you have a map. Of course, these maps are, named wrong. So yeah, so if you were to look at a map, obviously the Gaza Strip is separate from the West Bank. But in what was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, or the Second Intifada, the massive uprising in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the Israelis ran these massive incursions into different cities to destroy the Palestinian resistance. One of those operations took place in Jenin, specifically the Jenin refugee camp in 2002 under what was called Operation Protective Shield. Now, that operation resulted in the elimination of those Palestinian resistance groups. So there were a number of factions that were fighting there, but at the time, the Palestinian Authority, which is based out of Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, again, we'll pull this up here so the visual display is always helpful. So the Palestinian Authority now is led by the party Fatah. And back in the Second Intifada, when Yasser Arafat, the former leader of the Palestinian Authority and elected Palestinian president, was still around, he'd helped form these militia groups like the Tanzim and Kata'ib Shuhada al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. So they actually, participated in resisting the Israeli occupying forces. They based themselves in Jenin, and that's where you get some of these big figures from that era, like Zakaria Zubaydi and others, who are sort of big names that, if you're not familiar with it, these names might go over your head. But these are big figures in Palestine, and they've become legends amongst the Palestinian population there for their resistance. But the Israelis managed to crack down on these groups with brute force and dismantle a lot of them, kill a lot of the top commanders, and arrest many of those who participated in the armed resistance in the West Bank. Of course, it's not just in Jenin, Nablus, and Tulkarem. It's all, there's been resistance factions throughout the territory, which I won't get into all of the history of that, but that sort of triangle, as they call it, of resistance, it has always been the most prominent in the north of the West Bank. In fact, that goes back to, the Arab Revolt, and Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, who was the Syrian cleric who came to Palestine and sort of formed some of the first proper resistance cells against the Israelis and the British. And he was killed in Jenin in battle with British soldiers. Even when the war or ethnic cleansing campaign, but there was an armed element where Arab forces did come to try and help. There is major Arab commanders like Fawzi al-Qawqji who came and sort of set themselves up in the north of the West Bank, specifically around Jenin. And because of the resistance in Jenin, they were going to try and annex that territory, to take that territory, but it ended up holding because of the resistance in the West Bank. So it's always been a hotbed for that resistance. And then another one of the reasons why you see it being a hotbed of resistance is you have these camps, these refugee camps here. These are displaced refugees. And then in the old city of Nablus as well, you've got sort of a poorer population, which is where these sort of groups have sprung from. In the Gaza Strip, however, there was an Israeli incursion and attempt during the Second Intifada to destroy the resistance. And that was also located in the north, in the Gaza Strip, down to around the Jabalia area. And the Israelis failed to uproot the Qassam brigades and the other Palestinian factions. Now, in the West Bank, the strongest Palestinian factions were the Fatah, so the secular Palestinian party that led the Palestinian Authority factions, fighters, and also the PFLP. In Gaza, it was Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and also the PFLP. There were Fatah fighters, of course, but in particular, historically speaking, the PFLP in Gaza actually were a much stronger military force than Fatah-aligned fighters. So there is a difference there. Also, almost the entire population of Gaza are refugees. So it's like 75-80% of Gaza's population are refugees. They were forced from their homes between 1947 to 1949. And so these people, they're already been displaced. They have a lot less, and there's a lot less of this sort of also, classist elements and things that go on as well that sort of sometimes stifles resistance and gets in the way of stuff. And yeah, of course, even people, when they're under these ethnic cleansing campaigns and colonizing projects, they divide them. Whereas in the West Bank, a lot of people around Ramallah are from Ramallah. They're from Nablus, right? They're from Jenin. These are the areas where they originated. And especially if they are city people, they're sort of already de facto divided from like the Felahin, the villagers, and the Bedouin. So there's this sort of division that already exists. In Gaza, there's less of that. There are Bedouins, of course, but everyone was displaced, right? And that's the culture there of the displaced. Almost all of the leaders in Gaza are all, displaced from their homes, and they're descendant of refugees. You look at someone like Yahya Sinwar or somebody like this. These are people poor, they grew up poor, displaced in refugee camps, but that being said, in Gaza, the resistance was able to evolve after the Second Intifada. In the West Bank, it was killed also because around 2006, the US and the Israelis wanted to completely amend what was the Palestinian security forces under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And their guide to do this, of course, was Mahmoud Abbas. So some people think that Yasser Arafat was assassinated, and I think there's enough evidence to suggest that he was killed by Israel. But, I can't, it's not concrete. You can't say 100%. But anyway, there's enough there to lean towards that. But regardless, if that's true or not, Yasser Arafat died. Mahmoud Abbas, who was in the fold of the Palestine Liberation Organization and Palestinian Authority, but was never destined for leadership. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the Americans pressured Arafat to create a position of prime minister, which was not a thing under the Oslo process that created the Palestinian Authority. There was no prime minister, but he wanted a prime minister. And of course, the favored candidate by the United States was Mahmoud Abbas, who now is the Palestinian Authority president in the West Bank and rules over the territory with an iron fist. And, he's completely unelected. There's been no Palestinian elections whatsoever since 2006. And because of that, the Palestinian Authority security forces, they were sort of gutted. They were, retrained. They were repurposed so that they could not be used in the future to participate in an intifada in any way. They couldn't be used in the future, possibly to fight the Israelis. Their sole focus, the reason for them existing, was to police Palestinians inside the major cities, inside the West Bank, take that burden off of the Israeli occupying army, and to coordinate with the Israeli military to tackle Palestinian resistance, to spy on its own population with its preventative security forces, its intelligence wing of the Palestinian Authority security forces, and prevent there being any harm done to the settlers, the settlements, and the Israeli occupation forces, who are, of course, occupying illegally all of this land. So if you're a Palestinian and want to do armed action, chances are, if you form a large enough cell, the Palestinian Authority is going to know about that through its spies and is going to dismantle these cells. That's one of the reasons why it's been so difficult. Now, fast forwarding a little bit from all of this, because the Palestinian resistance in the West Bank, although there were occasionally attacks and things that happened, lone wolf attacks primarily, purely out of desperation, not, occasionally you would have some factions like the PFLP and their Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, the armed wing, which would do some action, or Qassam brigades in the West Bank, the Hamas armed wing, would do something, etc. But not much action. It's not really organized. Then in 2021, things started really changing because these groups popped up, like the Jenin brigades. We'll just put some more footage on screen here of the Jenin brigades. So this is just some footage so you could see, the sort of military parades they held in Jenin refugee camp, and they patrolled the refugee camp. And in fact, the Palestinian Authority's forces couldn't enter at certain points. But what happened is the Palestinian Authority the Abbas faction of the Palestinian Authority tried to exert influence over these groups. One thing you might realize about these groups, and here they are shooting at Israelis, the Israelis as they're trying to enter. And that's the main thing that they did, by the way. They weren't carrying out offensive operations. Very, very few of those happened. It was always defensive operations when Israeli forces would raid different places in Jenin. So they'd open fire on them and try and hold them back. And one thing you might know, which I was just about to get to, is all of these guys, there's nobody older involved in this. Very, very, very few people were above the age of like 25. A lot of them were, still teenagers, like people like 18, 17 years old that had picked up weapons because their friend had been killed by the Israelis or something horrible happened, and they've had their home destroyed, whatever it is. So they picked up rifles and they became part of, the Jenin brigades. And so this model, because Palestinians in other places in the West Bank started to see these groups emerge in Jenin, which came under the umbrella of the Jenin brigades, and it inspired them to do the same. So they started picking up weapons. They started creating small groups. And these groups were not well trained, not really all that well armed as well, but they had the spirit to fight. Then what happened is the Palestinian Authority, through its security forces, managed to have close relations with some of these groups. And these people don't want to fight with the Palestinian Authority. They want to fight with the Israeli occupying forces. And in places like Jenin, the city, the surrounding villages, the refugee camp, there are big figures, and trusted people and people with respect in society that have affiliations to the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and will be under that wing of Mahmoud Abbas, who controls the PA. And so they were able to try and negotiate and to monitor and influence the direction of these groups, or at least they tried to. And they tried to stop these groups from resisting. Now, what happened is the groups that went under the banner of Palestinian Islamic Jihad and went under the banner of like Salahuddin brigades, Mujahideen brigades, all of that, they didn't care. And Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades, they didn't care about that. But Hamas, they would not accept anything from Hamas. Israel would go in immediately and assassinate anyone that was affiliated with the Qassam brigades, because typically speaking, the Qassam brigades cells that were formed might have been a bit smaller, but they were well more organized and normally more well armed as well. So they started cracking down on them, and you would have all these different influences that tried to come in. They assassinated, in the case of, for example, here, the group that popped up in Nablus. It's called the Lion's Den, Harin al-Asud. That's the symbol there. They popped up in the old city of Nablus. And so originally they were formed of Palestinian fighters from different groups, the PFLP, Hamas, and of course people affiliated with Fatah. There are different wings of Fatah. Not all of them are affiliated with the Palestinian Authority leadership, which I won't go too deep into that. But these people were affiliated with all different groups. What they started doing is they cracked down. The Palestinian Authority would arrest members of Hamas. The Israelis would assassinate and assassinated prominent members of the group that were part of the PFLP. And they wanted to isolate them, so they're down to individuals who are part of Fatah. Then they basically convinced the organization, many people, to hand themselves in and hand over their weapons to the Palestinian Authority and disband groups like this. This is how the Palestinian Authority would get rid of groups in the West Bank. Even though there were still fighters that are part of these groups and wanted to continue, the leadership structure was taken away, assassinated, jailed, or sort of forced to withdraw their role from these organizations. And they would sort of hold on to these groups that way, and they would try and influence them. So in the case of Jenin, for example, this is in 2021. It's a brief video here about the man that started all of this. His name is Jamil Al-Amouri, and he started the Jenin brigades. And note here, he was born in 1996. So again, these are all young people. These are not people from that older generation of resistance fighters. These are people that don't have a lot of experience, and they're fighting because they have chosen that they want to finally resist what Israel is doing to them. They've seen the aggression. They see the expansion of settlements. They're living through all of this torment every day. And so they have chosen to rise up without anyone properly backing them, and without anyone, any lifeline, really. So here, this is translated, this video by the Resistance News Network, I believe. So I was just saying about how his personality was, loved and respected. He joined Islamic Jihad early on during his life, and he carried out his first military mission in January of 2020. And then from there, this sort of started taking hold after the Saif al-Quds battle, as it was called, or some people call it the Unity Uprising. And this started moving massively, towards, I think around September to November, the Jenin brigades and the Lion's Den and all of these groups started emerging in the occupied West Bank. What's important, the reason why I'm showing all of this, the reason why I've gone for this explanation of the armed groups, sort of briefly to outline everything here, is because there are fighters in the West Bank. There are people that will pick up weapons, and they have access to weapons in the West Bank. What happened eventually is that the Palestinian Authority, after October 7, decided to team up with the Israelis to crack down upon and even execute in broad daylight Palestinian resistance fighters. They imprisoned some, tortured them, and they allied themselves completely with the Israelis. They did the opposite of what a Palestinian national liberation movement would do when there's a genocide being inflicted in Gaza. Now, because of that, these groups basically were abandoned and betrayed, and they weren't able to continue the way that they were before. The Jenin refugee camp was blown to pieces. The Israelis invaded and blew up all of the buildings there. They displaced the population, and they displaced the population of what's called Nur al-Shams refugee camp in Tulkarem as well. They forced tens of thousands of people out of their homes. And again, the Palestinian Authority has such a stranglehold over them. But these fighters, not all of them are dead or in jail. And like the original sort of group of those Jenin brigades guys, I interviewed a bunch of them. All of them were killed by the Israelis or imprisoned. That first line of the Jenin brigades and the Lion's Den and all these groups, most of those people have been killed by the Israelis now. And so they're in a difficult position, but they sprung up in 2021 with no one backing them, no real direction, no senior people in positions of leadership for them that were there on the ground with them, really, to properly guide them, no proper security protocols or anything. Like these guys, it looks like these videos that are put together, like these are SWAT teams and stuff like that. These are young guys who are between the ages of, most of them between 19 and 25, who are just frustrated, pick up weapons, learn how to build IEDs, and wait for the Israelis to come to them and attack them. That's all they were doing. But there are cells that are more sophisticated, and if Palestinian groups can get their hands on certain weapons, like these FPV drones, it will be more difficult to track them. It will be more difficult to combat these militant groups and also influence them. So when they come back, it's very likely, and we've seen a few attacks carried out in recent months by groups in Jenin, they're going to be more underground. They're going to be less flashy. And that's most likely going to be the strategy that they'll have to use. Smaller cells, better security. There might even be larger groups that end up popping up, but then they just become an easy target for Israel to go in and just kill them and their families and blow up their homes. because that's what they do. If you do anything against Israel, you raise a gun to an Israeli soldier, they'll come in and they'll target your family for it. That's the way that they deal with this. So the Israelis now are in a position where they're afraid of the possibility that the FPV drones will arrive in the West Bank. And my suspicion is people already have them. Also, this happened last year, but I thought it would be worth just pulling this up. But these are some crudely made rockets, which were made in a village near Ramallah last year, which were taken by the Israeli military. And the idea was, I think it's Kafr Nama, where this event happened. And there were some people that fought against the Israelis that did an operation. A bunch of Palestinians got killed. But these were sort of the rockets that were presented. These are like the most crudely made rockets that you could imagine, right? These are not like even what Hamas and other factions in Gaza created. They're very crudely made. And they actually fired some of them. At one point, there's a video of them firing towards the settlements. Now, these, of course, are not going to do much damage, right? They're not much of a threat to Israel. What I'm trying to get at here is there's a desire. Now, the Israelis can't control their own soldiers, and they've now got this settler movement and a psychotic Israeli society that will side with criminals who violate their own laws and codes of conduct, like as if they matter. And it's almost becoming a state within a state that they have in terms of these settlers. And keep in mind for the Israelis, and even if you look at it on a map, to make it a bit more simple, the West Bank to the Israeli, this magical line doesn't exist to Israelis. The settlements are scattered throughout the West Bank, all over. They drive straight from Tel Aviv to those settlements. They have no place that blocks them in most cases, or the settlements are behind those walls and they're cutting into places in the West Bank. So for them, going into their settlements it's just something normal. It's for them, the Israeli biblical heartlands. They don't see a difference between Tel Aviv and their settlements in the West Bank. They're the same to them. And so for them, and the situation that we have emerging, the settlers are a huge faction, a very vocal faction. They're motivated. They have now influence in positions of power, influence massively in the military. Even the ex-head of the Israeli army, the ex-chief of staff, he was a settler, right? Not the current one, but the ex-one was a settler, like West Bank settler. So they're in a predicament where they lack reserve soldiers. They've got all of these crazy people. They've got these settler independent militias within the army itself, and they are going crazy on the West Bank. The unemployment rate in the West Bank went from around 12% in before October 7, 2023 to now over 30%. The Palestinian Authority is probably the biggest employer, really. It is the biggest employer. 25% of the population is employed by the Palestinian Authority. Then you have the Israeli settlements and other areas where people have permits to go and work, but that's a lot less than it used to be historically. You have NGOs that employ people as well. So the situation is that people are severely controlled by the Palestinian Authority, controlled by these NGO networks, and unfortunately, they've forgotten. A lot of people forgot one of the biggest lessons that should have been taken from their religious doctrines, which was not to deal in interest, right? And the issue of these loans inside of the West Bank have sort of enslaved people, specifically in the cities as well. These loans and credit cards that they take have sort of enslaved them to the dollar. And it's set up specifically to do that. And I explained that a little bit in the past live stream that we did here. But, and just to sort of show, how the historical arc goes here, because people might be, well, okay, they don't have great amounts, not demonstrating anything. insane here right at this point. And, there's nothing to sort of get excited about here, whether that's the word to describe this or not, in terms of people resisting. But you have to remember the situation has been up and down like this for a very long time. The will of people to continue to resist is what truly matters, because the Palestinian liberation struggle was centered for some time in Amman, the PLO. They were kicked out, and they were then based in Beirut. Actually, here's a clip that I pulled up from that, because you might see the similarities with today in Israel talking about withdrawing from South Lebanon and all of that, and Hezbollah is now its enemy and the biggest terrorist. Here's a clip from 1978, Yasser Arafat, and this is commenting on an Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon at that time to deal with the Palestine Liberation Organization. So we'll take a look at this, and then I'll continue on that point.
To say that your mass media, the Western mass media, always beside the Israelis. Your baby in this area. And you are forgetting completely this organized terrorism, even in the United Nations Security Council. You refuse to condemn this barbarian attack on the South, but you bless it. And you said that we accept the raid, but it was a little bit more than required. I have to ask those who used to speak about human rights. Where is this human rights there in the South? Did you see the picture there? Our camps, Lebanese villages who had been smashed completely, some of these villages had been smashed with Phantom, with Skyhawk, with Mirage, with F-15, with Cancer bomb, with Lance rocket, with the Navy. Civilian war, yes, because it is your baby who did it. It is Israel who did it.
So we moved into the south, also intending to kill as many as we can and destroy as many of the bases as they have, and then asked the civilized world whether they have a solution. Presently, there is a suggested solution that is in the process of in the making. We'll see how it operates. If it's successful, very nice. If not, we'll have to take into account the results.
If the Palestinians remain south of the Litani, will you still withdraw completely out of Lebanon?
There are no Palestinians south of the Litani except in the Tyre area now.
If they remain there, will you withdraw right out of the Lebanon?
We shall withdraw when the United Nations forces take over and take responsibility that no military action is taken against us from South Lebanon.
How long will it be, do you think, judging now, before you are out of South Lebanon?
I hope that as soon as possible. I hope that within 3 weeks, a maximum of 4 weeks.
But the PLO does not accept the principle of ceasefire against Israel. Moreover, Yasser Arafat intends to return to the south.
For me, I can't say, or I can't accept for ceasing fire, as they are still there in the south. And I will continue fighting till they will withdraw from the south.
Does that mean that once they are out of the south, you will be in to do whatever you were doing there before, training, etc., in exactly the same way as before? Or will the UN be there, and will they be able to stop you doing what you want, or do you respect their right to stop you? What's your feeling about that?
We have to understand what is the task of this United Nations forces. It is to control the withdrawal of the Israelis from the south. Not to forget that our existence in this area due to an agreement or many agreements between us and the Lebanese authorities. It's very important. So we are there due to this agreement. And according to this, it is our right to return back.
You expect the situation that existed before the invasion to become again the situation in the future?
Why not?
So the reason I show that is very simple. I mean, the amount of parallels to what we're seeing today. Back then, the PLO were the terrorists, right? And the West viewed them as these horrible, nasty terrorists that couldn't be trusted. And that was the reason why Israel had to, in 1978, invade and take over territory in the south of Lebanon. And by 1982, of course, they would invade Lebanon. They would uproot the PLO. When the Palestinian resistance decided to hand over its weapons directly, but take its weapons and its fighters and flee to Tunisia in North Africa, suddenly the Israelis would use their fascist militia allies and carry out massacres in refugee camps like Sabra and Shatila, which was the worst, which killed around 3,500 people. And then they would occupy formally a strip of South Lebanon in 1985, which is when Hezbollah was born, in order to resist, because again, the people of the South are Shia. So this is a Shia Islamic organization, which would end up resisting the Israelis. And so now we hear these same exact excuses, these same exact lines, but it's just with a different actor resisting today. The reason why I pull that up, because the PLO, of course, was defeated in Lebanon. And the PLO suffered massive setbacks. They eventually signed this compromise agreement and became collaborators, essentially, with the Israelis in the West Bank and Gaza, although their attempted coup in Gaza failed and Hamas took over Gaza after being democratically elected. Because, of course, the West and Israel hate democracy and democratic elections. They don't believe in them. They just simply reject any Palestinian democracy. And that being said, Mahmoud Abbas, who is the unelected president of the Palestinian Authority, who the vast majority of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza before, when they were polled, said they wanted him removed and they don't support him and say he should resign. And the guy's like 1 billion years old, and somehow, he's still there operating. He has 1 billion diseases. I seriously believe, if anyone knows much about Mahmoud Abbas, the Israelis are experimenting with new technology, which keeps people alive forever or something with him, because of how long he's been kicking around and continuing to control the Palestinian Authority. Now, he's declared in November, and a lot of people brought this up and wanted me to address it, that there will be legislative elections, Palestinian legislative elections. They're going to have the elections in November. The last time he did this, he called for them in 2021. They were supposed to happen in 2022. And suddenly it appeared as if he was going to lose both the presidential and the legislative elections, because Fatah itself split up into different lists, right? Most people wanted, and it looked like they would vote for Marwan Barghouti to be the Palestinian Authority president, even though he's in jail, that he would be the most popular candidate. And so Abbas and his faction, they said, oh, well, because the Israelis are not allowing us to have booths in East Jerusalem, we can't do the elections. That's how it ended. Right now, the PA is suffering greatly. So they're trying to put pressure on the Israelis. Now it's massively backfiring, because what's happened is all of the opposition factions within Fatah, all of them have sided with Hamas, the PFLP, and also even Islamic Jihad, which doesn't normally participate in elections. All of the factions, Palestinian factions, came together, including dissidents like, Dahlan and his men, the Emirati, intelligence guy now, who tried to actually do the coup against Hamas back in the day in Gaza anyway, which led to all of this mess. All of them have come into one unity party. And on the other side is Mahmoud Abbas, and his bunch of, paid agents, who are, running around begging Saudi Arabia to give them money and praising the Israelis and trying to make their Israeli masters happy. And so what will likely happen with these elections, in my opinion, is Abbas will, again, if it's not the Jerusalem issue, will be something else, most likely Jerusalem. He will end up saying, Israel's preventing us, so we can't hold elections because it jeopardizes, our mission to have a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. And he'll use this as an excuse and say, I have to cancel the elections. Well, you knew going into this each time that was the case. So what's the real reason that Abbas is claiming he's holding elections in Palestine? I would be willing to bet he's trying to extract concessions and to get money, some of that tax revenue, and get some money poured in. He wants something from the Israelis. So this is a way to put pressure, because the last thing Israel wants is a democratically elected Palestinian authority that Hamas is part of, Islamic Jihad is part of, PFLP is part of, right? They don't want that. So, and not if they were to do, vote for Marwan Barghouti, it would revive, the idea of the Palestinian liberation movement. It would put the PA and the PLO back into the hands of people that actually want to direct it somewhere, instead of just sit around on their resources and make money, and just screw everyone else. Let's not care about what anyone else does, right? So that's the last thing they want, the Israelis. And it just so happens to coincide, there's the Israeli elections that happen, was it October 27 or 29, one of those dates. And then November, straight away, all the Palestinian elections are happening. So I bet you anything, there's going to be some concessions straight after the election that are given. And that's what this is all about. That's what I would say. But having watched that, the Israeli forces are back occupying southern Lebanon, right? That clip that we just saw in 1978 of them talking about, when are the Israelis going to withdraw from South Lebanon? And the Israelis are, we're killing all of the terrorists and we're going in and all of this. And of course, they're committing war crimes and blowing up Lebanese villages, right? It's the same cycle over and over again. But one thing that we should all take from this is, where there are people who are oppressed and have the means, even if limited, they will fight. And there is a regional resistance. We haven't got into all the other fronts so much today. There's a lot going on in Lebanon and Syria that we could cover. But I thought that it would be important to sort of cover these groups, cover what's going on in the West Bank, because these, people think that things are hopeless there. I don't think it is, if there is some kind of mass movement. But I truly believe that the number one obstacle to a proper Palestinian uprising that is going to be successful in the West Bank is the Palestinian Authority run by Mahmoud Abbas. And there's just, if it was an actual PA, during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, they declared it, they got behind it, right? The PA back then and Arafat got behind the uprising. Now, it's not to say that they weren't influencing it in some ways that Palestinian groups and people in society may not have liked. There are, of course, details there that things aren't all black and white in every sense. But the Palestinian Authority was at least part of some sort of liberation struggle, part of a Palestinian movement. It had political capital. It had legitimacy and power, at least symbolically, in the Arab world and broader world as well. But now we don't see that, because this bunch of collaborators, that's what it has become, the Palestinian Authority. They have a collaborator force, have taken over and are just there, and they just want to keep the ball rolling and keep the situation as is, and they don't do anything. The Israeli settlers come and besiege villages. They go into Area B. They violate every single law. They commit a genocide in Gaza. They violate, the sanctity of Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or whatever it may be. They don't do anything. They're not a national liberation movement. They're not taken seriously anywhere in the world by any leadership or movement anyway. And unfortunately, they're stifling the ability for there to be legitimate resistance. And that's the reality there of what's going on in the West Bank. But smaller cells now, if they can arm themselves with weapons like FPV drones, are going to pose an enormous problem. And also, that population is being tormented right now. The villages are being ethnically cleansed. The people are being pushed. They're being squeezed. They're trying to hold on to, like a lot of people right now, the West Bank are trying to hold on to what they have. But the poorer they get, the more their back is pushed up against the wall, the more resistance there's going to be. And that is what scares the Israelis, because if it spirals out of control, and it could at any time, and the West Bank is one of the hardest areas to predict an uprising happening or not happening in the world. If it happens, then it could actually be to a massive detriment to the Israelis. Just to pull this up here, this is a piece done in August by NPR, and they're interviewing Israeli soldiers, right? And they're talking about the severe shortage of army reservists. By the way, if the Palestinian Authority, as we know it now, collapses or changes, they're going to have to be deployed into all the major cities in the West Bank. Or if there's simply just a mass uprising in the West Bank, which spirals out of control, they have to deploy all their forces into the West Bank. They're going to need about 200,000 men to do that. They don't have the numbers. They can't take on the West Bank right now if it blows up all out, unless they've closed the other fronts. So right now, Israel's in this situation, and you see, like in this interview, right? They're interviewing them, and they're saying, for example, here, this is Israeli complaining, "I think that Israel is very much a post-traumatic nation." Ya haram. We've got all these people with PTSD now. Oh, we're suffering. We're suffering. Feel bad for us. Feel bad for us. Anyway, getting sidetracked here. But, the Israelis have a shortage of reserves. Their troops are under, stress. And they're fighting in Lebanon. They're still heavily involved in Lebanon. If Lebanon escalates massively, they have to send more forces, tens of thousands more to Lebanon to combat Hezbollah. They have to, if anything happens in Gaza, they have to send tens of thousands more there. They have to have more troops than exist to combat these free fronts if they were to launch at once. Now, the Lebanon front is already pretty much open. That could open at any time. If the West Bank goes up at this, even if it's non-violent civil resistance and the people are just coming out throwing stones, right, and burning tires, and they go into an open revolt at the same time that Lebanon happens, and Gaza decides to go at the same time, Israel is finished. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen, because the West Bank did absolutely nothing for the entirety of the genocide, really, other than these armed groups that we just spoke about. Who fought valiantly, and most of their leaderships were killed and arrested and stuff. But this situation is a very serious one. There's a reason why Israel allowed for a Palestinian Authority to exist. And the reason is very simple. They did not want to have to control the Palestinian population themselves, because it is so incredibly difficult for them to do it. It drains them economically. It drains their number of soldiers that they need to use, like physically, they're going to be drained. But also, it stops them from focusing on other fronts. So, and it's a PR problem, of course, but now I don't think they care about that anymore, because everyone knows what they are and what they're about. But in order to stop what was known as the first Intifada, the mass uprising in the West Bank and Gaza, they had to deploy hundreds of thousands of soldiers and, occupy the major cities. And it was a massive burden for them. The Palestinian Authority, the reason why Israel created it or allowed it to be created and then amended it to get it to where it is today, is to create a complicit Palestinian force that is there to control its own population, to allow Israel to do whatever it wants, cost-free. Hamas, things didn't go to plan with Gaza and Hamas, right? But it was never powerful enough to properly challenge them, so they just sort of pushed it to the side. Like, Gaza is an issue, it's annoying, it's a nuisance. That's the way the Israelis viewed it, right? They hated Palestinians, they were super racist, but they never thought about it as a major threat. And then suddenly this insane military operation is pulled off where the Israeli Sovereign Command collapses and you've got 400 dead soldiers and security forces, all of the technology that you had, everything, your intelligence agencies and your military, and it all failed, right? And now they've gone psychotic. But Israel, of course, knows all of this, everything that you've heard here. And so it will have some contingencies, but things can spiral in a way that they cannot control. And if they do, then they're going to have a very tough time controlling this. And that's the danger of them being in perpetual war, because if they are in perpetual war like this, eventually, already we are seeing what it does to their society and the radicalization from within and the hatred for each other. But also, they're just going to be constantly fighting. They're going to be a warlike nation of people that don't like dying, by the way, and they're not like Ukrainians, Russians, or the Lebanese and Palestinians, where, they'll put their bodies on the line, for what they believe in their country. Israelis are not like that. Israelis are like the most cowardly military you could ever imagine, a participation trophy military. And that's why they couldn't go in Gaza and fight them. They never even tried to fight Hamas on the ground or any of the Palestinian factions on the ground, because in 2014, they learned that they would have to suffer massive casualties if they go and do that, if they want to go after them and try and find them where they're at and target them. If they want to do that on the ground, they're going to suffer massively. They didn't want to, and their society can't cope with it. So what do? Even when they lose soldiers in Lebanon and Gaza, they would cover it up most of the time. They don't admit any dead soldiers from like 1 or 2 from all of the Iranian ballistic missile attacks. They just never admit soldiers dying. They just cannot cope with it. And this is the spider's web. And the spider's got tangled in his own web. That's the problem here. Because perpetual war, or you do some sort of agreement. And an agreement is just not in the books for them. So perpetual war, eventually one of those fronts will blow up in a way that you cannot control, and then it's over. You're done. You don't have the troops. You don't have the ability to contain it. And so they keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing on everyone. And eventually, again, this is going to result in something that they couldn't anticipate. In 1978, they thought, 1982, they thought they got rid of the PLO, that they've defeated them, that this is a massive victory, right? A victory against the Soviets, a victory against global terrorism. And then what emerges afterwards? Well, the secular nationalist groups are replaced with Islamic groups. So as long as people are occupied, as long as people are being killed and are facing ethnic cleansing and all the horrors that are being committed to them, they will continue to resist. And again, where there's a will, there's a way. So if you've got this far into this video, please do hit that like button. Please do add a comment underneath and let us know what you think of the show and what you may like to hear more of in future episodes. Also, we are looking for 300 new members to keep this show alive. Of course, the algorithm does not like us, and the footage we show or the commentary that we bring, the analysis, they don't really like that at all, of course. So it's up to our viewers. If you like this show, if you like what you're seeing, then help us out with a like, a share, a comment, anything that you can here. Support independent media, because of course we need it more now than ever before. And of course, we'll be back again on Thursday. We'll be following more developments. Does look like, since we've been on, Iran has struck a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. So there is a lot going there, and we'll continue to bring more updates, all of the footage from the battlefield and analysis, so that you can make up your own mind on what is going on, and some of that information that you're most likely, definitely not going to get the corporate media. So thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day or night wherever you are. We'll be back on Thursday, 4 p.m. CST.